Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I want to start us off by saying, fundamentally, the right to a fair and secure election is foundational to the function of our democracy. But yet, this right is being challenged by the public health crisis in our state and nation. Minnesota prides itself on consistently having the highest rate of voter turnout in the country, and we want to continue that because every Minnesotan deserves fair and secure voting rights, whether we're in the middle of a public health emergency or not. So today, we are calling on Senate Republicans to work with us through committees and floor hearings to pass legislation that secures fair and safe elections and expands opportunities and alternatives for people to safely and securely cast their ballot. There is without a doubt a public health need for us to pass measures expanding access to voting by mail and giving the Secretary of State authority during a peacetime emergency to implement statewide vote by mail and relocate or consolidate polling locations. For example, under normal circumstances, we have a number of polling locations that are in senior living facilities, and that is done to make it convenient for seniors to be able to vote. But obviously, given the current health scare and concerns, that's probably not the best idea. We need to give the Secretary of State the flexibility to be able to adapt to the current situation. Forcing Minnesotans to show up to crowded polling places would only jeopardize the progress we've made in Minnesota. Passing legislation that allows communities across the state to vote by mail is crucial, timely, and a public health need. And I would also add something that we've seen in recent reporting following the recent April 7th election in Wisconsin. In Milwaukee, they are now attributing 7 cases of COVID-19 as likely contracted during that election that happened just a couple of weeks ago. We need to make sure Minnesotans can vote safely. Minnesotans have a right to make their voices heard without having to risk the health and safety of their families, and to fail to pass the proactive measures that we're highlighting today would put the health and safety of Minnesotans at risk. We must protect their right to vote now more than ever. We only have 4 weeks of session left, so we need to start working on these measures now. We call on Senate Republicans to join us to do the work now to ensure Minnesotans can exercise their right to vote, regardless of the social distancing circumstances we may or may not be in at that time. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Senator Carlson to talk about some of the proposals that we are supporting.
Thank you, Senator Kent. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Carlson, and I represent the District 51, which includes parts of the cities of Eagan and Burnsville. I represent the DFL lead in the state government and elections policy committee. And I have to say that now more than ever, it's time for the legislature to protect and to guarantee each Minnesotan the fundamental right to a free and fair election, as well as being safe to exercise that right. Ensuring a fair and a legitimate election during this public health crisis must be a priority, and it should not come at the cost of the fear of the lives of citizens. We do have a fear problem, and that is shared by 2/3 of the people that have responded to a poll, and they said that they are afraid to go to their precincts to do an in-person vote. That's too many people. Look no further than the neighbors in Wisconsin, as what was already said, where thousands of people were forced to choose between their health and fulfilling their civic duty. Now is the time for us to prepare a contingency plan to make sure our elections are adapting to the new reality without putting people at risk. The threat of COVID-19 will turn these thousands of people away from the polls in Minnesota if nothing is done. We already know 2/3 of the voters are concerned about that safety, and we want that 2/3, or we want those people who do not vote today by mail, which is all but about somewhere between 150 and 190,000 people who vote by mail and have voted by mail for many years. But we know that will increase, so we have to react to that. Right now, we can and should take those steps, like even a statewide vote by mail, unlocking the approximately $17 million in the Help America Vote Act funding to protect Minnesotans and shore up our elections. It is critical that we have a hearing as soon as possible on these measures. There is some legislation that is being tuned up right now that will adjust some of these initiatives, but it does not include the statewide vote by mail. We would like to see that addressed. The Secretary of State must be given the necessary tools to ensure Minnesota voters are guaranteed their right to vote during this pandemic. The legislature should consider and pass the legislation to allow Secretary Simon to expand this vote by mail to consolidate polling locations if some facilities are deemed untenable, to be able to train workers in some of the places where people are at risk to be able to do absentee voting, and to allow electronic signatures for nominating petitions to reduce the person-to-person contact. The Secretary of State's office has confirmed that the CARE Act funding, this is the HAVA and CARES initiative that adds to it, must be authorized legislatively. We need to provide those necessary resources to recruit and protect Minnesota's 30,000 poll workers. The Public Health Agency will make it more difficult to recruit and train, the emergency will make it more difficult to recruit and train poll workers who are absolutely critical to ensuring safe and efficient voting. Local administrators will also need financial help to process the influx of additional absentee ballots and alter polling locations to maintain social distancing and safe guidelines, as well as the sanitizing. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Senator Rest for additional comments.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I want to highlight another point that is not only timely, but refers to the election that we've already had, and that is the March 3rd presidential primary. The deadline is coming up within the next few weeks for the Secretary of State to provide the data from that election according to current law. We have tried with a lot of support, actually, from co-authors, from not only Democrats, but also Republicans, to protect the privacy of that data, making sure that in the bill that I authored that it would be only available to be used by the national parties in determining delegate strength, and then instructing the Secretary of State to, in effect, destroy that particular data. So far, I haven't been able to get a hearing on that bill, but I think if we had it on the Senate floor, it would pass with strong bipartisan support. That bill number, by the way, is Senate File 2986. And that leads to a broader point, and that is election security and vulnerability is real. We know that in 2016, we were a target. We were a target for our system being hacked. We were able to fight that off, but we know that systems across the country are going to be subject to that same kind of vulnerability in 2020. So we need to pass the legislation that accepts that critical federal funding that and security that Senator Carlson just referred to provide that kind of security without really tying it to voter disenfranchisement. Making our elections secure, having our voters confident that their information is going to be protected by the government, by the Secretary of State's office, so that when they cast a ballot, The only person who knows who cast that particular ballot is the voter himself or herself. So we need to make these elections secure. And it's not a partisan issue, and it should never be a partisan issue to encourage people to go to the polls and elect the members of their government at any and all levels. So I'm hoping that together, working with Republicans and with the House of Representatives, we can pass significant funding legislation, HAVA, and also a number of election security provisions. This issue is important not only in the metropolitan area, but it's certainly important to voters throughout the state, and in particular, and especially perhaps in greater Minnesota. So I'm going to ask Senator Frentz to comment on that and the activities that he's been engaged in.
Well, thank you very much for that, Senator Rest. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the press conference. Greetings from beautiful North Mankato. As a greater Minnesota legislator, as a member of the Senate DFL, I'm asking all of us this simple question. Who is against making it easier for Minnesotans to vote? The answer is not the voters. On the very day of the Wisconsin presidential primary, April 7th, Reuters issued the results of a poll in which 72% of Americans said they would like to be given the option to vote by mail. I note for that survey, 65% of Republicans in that survey indicated they would like the opportunity to vote by mail. Out here, we have townships who vote by mail. In fact, you may know that over 130,000 Minnesotans already vote from home, and comfortably so. Down here in our townships, many of them only offer voting by mail and without a whiff of suggestion of fraud. So what we're asking for Minnesotans to consider is, why wouldn't we, in this environment of COVID-19, take every precaution for public health and allow Minnesotans to each get a ballot mailed to them by the Secretary of State with a stamp? Keep in mind, this will affect groups like older Minnesotans, Minnesotans with disabilities. And in those that ask about absentee voting, keep in mind, there are two groups of voters to which this is important. First, those that are going to vote one way or the other. This will make it easier for them. But I'm very interested, as are many of my greater Minnesota colleagues, in the second group, those who will vote if you send them a ballot, but those who might not if you do not. The more we make it easier for Minnesotans to vote, the more of us will vote. The more of us that vote, the more the result reflects the will of the people. That's democracy, isn't it? Now, as many of you know, Representative Jamie Long of Minneapolis and I issued a plan that we thought would move the ball forward. And a lot of what Senator Rest and Senator Carlson are talking about is included in that plan. In addition, we'd like to send every eligible but unregistered Minnesota voter a form so that they could be registered. We'd like to discuss drop boxes outside polling places and government buildings to make it easier for those that are more cautious. We don't know what the COVID-19 environment will be in August or November, and we'd like to set up structure now that will prevent Minnesotans from having to choose between their health and their right to vote, both of which are critically important. I want to address one of the questions that's already been posted on the chat board before we turn it back to Senator Kent. It was asked, have we talked to Senator Kiffmeyer or Senator Gazelka about these? I did appear on Capitol Report this weekend, remotely, of course, and Senator Kiffmeyer was our guest, in which Senator Kiffmeyer, who I respect very much, made the comment, vote by mail is not going to be successful in our caucus. My point to Senator Kiffmeyer and Senator Gazelka would be, that's not an argument that it's a bad idea. And so we ask Senate Republicans to join us in this discussion and to take the true temperature of the people of Minnesota who clearly want the option to vote by mail. And while we are discussing this as a 2020 plan to address COVID-19, I think many Minnesotans will find that there are a lot of good reasons to be looking at this election type of reform longer term. It's for our democracy. And after all, that's what makes us special here in the United States of America. With that, I want to turn it back to Senator Kent. Thank everybody and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Senator Frentz. As he said, we had the one question from Steve Karnowski from AP about if we've reached out to Senators Kiffmeyer, Gazelka. Senator Carlson, in working on your legislation and as lead of the DFL lead on the Elections Committee, do you have any other comments to respond to that question?
The only thing I can say is that we did have and it was a Zoom meeting a couple of weeks ago where all of these initiatives were presented. And there wasn't any specific response from Senator Kiffmeyer. There was one from Representative Nash, who is, he's the lead in the House on elections. And he said, it's no way. Now, some of the initiatives that we have are really not controversial, like moving precincts out of nursing homes. We need to be able to do that, and that's what's in this bill as well. And so at the end of that meeting, we did not get negative response from Senator Kiffmeyer, and there has been a couple of meetings with the House because they're trying to tune up a bill as we speak. And at this point, I have not talked to Senator Kiffmeyer about their bill because they wanted to handle it themselves at this point, and they have gotten agreement from Representative Nash on their initiatives, and as well as Representative Keel, and they wanted to use Representative Nash and Keel to be part of the discussion with Senator Kiffmeyer. So I expect to be talking with Senator Kiffmeyer very shortly.
Thank you, Senator Carlson. Shannon Larkey asks, are the changes you're interested in implementing simply due to COVID-19, or are they meant to be ongoing? Senator Frentz, why don't you start with that?
Thanks, Shannon. And I hope you noticed that plug for Capitol Report in there. No charge for that. We are talking about plans we think are necessary for 2020 as the state deals with COVID-19. I think we owe it to Minnesotans to make it safe for them to vote and give them as many ways to vote so their votes can be counted. Having said that, once we make these changes, if we're able to make them, I think enough Minnesotans will be asking why we wouldn't look at some of these things longer term. Will become questions that become not how can we make those changes, but how can we not? And I'm anxious to discuss this with our colleagues across the aisle as to their view of what Minnesotans and Americans want.
One change would be permanent, and that is protecting voter privacy in a presidential nomination primary. I think it's clear across the country that precinct caucuses that are called to start that process of delegate selection are really not going to be used very much anymore. We are going to be using presidential nomination primaries, even in precinct caucus states. And we need to make sure that we protect the privacy of those voters on an ongoing basis, and also meet the very reasonable need of political parties that the ballots that are cast have integrity, that they're fairly counted and represent the will of the people in the party who are choosing who their presidential nominee is going to be.
And I might add to that yes, the answer to your question, Shannon, is yes and yes. We are attempting, you might have sensed a little bit of a double-pronged approach here. One is that the bill that we had been discussing prior to right now was one that there were 6 initiatives in there that would blink off as soon as the pandemic emergency would be shut off. So there would not be any ongoing changes. Now, there is the initiative from Senator Frentz that he would like to make these changes permanent. And of course, I think you can sense that I would like to make them permanent too. But the first bill that we were looking at is to just address the emergency.
Tim Pugmire from NPR asks, why not just boost the current absentee ballot option?
Well, one reason is, and Senator Frentz brought this up to start with, who's going to say no to making elections in Minnesota for eligible registered voters to exercise their franchise. Who's going to say no to that? And these initiatives are going to allow for that to happen. And it comes up because of the emergency. But sometimes good ideas come out of emergency situations. And this really, by going to mail-in ballots, we are heeding the voices of the voters who say, we want to vote. We want to vote legitimately. We want our vote to have integrity. And we don't want politicians making it harder for us. So I think that there's a very strong voice coming from Minnesota voters to move in that direction, protect their privacy, but encourage their participation so that we can remain number one in the nation. Absent that, we would have, if the Republicans say, no, we don't want people voting easier, we can still use the early voting, otherwise early voting, and and absentee ballots. But I don't see that there's a good reason to demand that be the system we use when we can, at least for this election, use another one that respects the voters and encourages them to go to the polls and choose the people they want to represent them.
Shannon Lerke from Capitol Report asks, is there the same level of concern about election interference in 2020 as there was before the global pandemic? In other words, has the pandemic quieted those who seek to interfere American elections? I'll just say, in reading some of the media this morning, and I apologize, I can't say exactly where I saw it, probably was the Washington Post or the New York Times, that we are seeing interference, not necessarily, I'm not talking about in the actual election systems per se, but through social media and through the types of messaging and sowing of chaos, that people are concerned that we are seeing foreign actors already engaging in that. Either any of my colleagues want to address also from the election side, the concerns there?
I would just say, I don't think there's any reduction in foreign bad actors that want to interfere with our elections. The fact that we're dealing with COVID-19, and hopefully successfully so, should not change our level of alarm. We may be talking more about COVID-19, but I don't believe we're seeing any reduction in Russia or other countries that seek to interfere.
And I would add to that too, that Minnesota has a very robust and secure system. What we were talking about as interference in other states is a bad actor going into our registration system and modifying or getting rid of voters, doing some kind of bad behaviors there. Now, what's somewhat, first of all, we have a very secure system, but also we have the backup. And that backup is that if your registration has been somehow manipulated or toyed with, you have the ability to, on election day, to re-register. So that cancels out a lot of these bad actors and what they might try to do to, let's say, surgically remove voters from the voter files. We are pretty safe on our system, but we also have that backup.
And this will be the last question. What do you believe is the heart of the Republicans' objection to this? If you were to separate out some of the related issues such as HAVA and presidential primary party preference data, would it increase the chances of getting an agreement with GOP lawmakers?
Well, who knows? They really haven't shared why these proposals are objectionable, only that they are. And, I would ask them to, get a broader perspective on what voting means to Minnesotans and be more trusting in how voters go to the polls, and maybe to explain if they can why these proposals are dead in the water to them. They're not dead in the water to Minnesota voters, that's for sure. They want to do these things. Why would the Republicans, exercising common sense, say no?
And I would add, it's not like there has been strong bipartisan support for authorizing HAVA in the past in the Minnesota Senate either. And, we're really concerned that that will continue to be something that is manipulated as a political bargaining chip or something, which is completely wrong. Those are funds that have already been allocated to all the states. Just as we went through it last year, we should get those authorized. We should get them authorized as soon as possible, because that just allows the Secretary of State and our local units of government to implement a strong election system. I also want to say, because Theo Keith had a follow-up to Tim Pugmire's question, and I would like to get that because I do think it deserves some clarification. And Senator Carlson, I'm going to put you on the spot for this one. What is the Senate DFL's issue with expanding absentee balloting, as Kiffmeyer has suggested? Why is that not a compromise? And what's the need to go all the way to mail-in voting? And I think you've had some conversations with the Secretary of State's office that helps explain this.
Yes, some of that is technical and financial. Going to all absentee balloting, we already know that it's going to probably double this year just with the present system. And as everyone should know, May 13th is the first day that people can actually request an absentee ballot. Now, what's going to happen is that's going to overload the counties. We have millions of voters that are going to be requesting these absentee ballots. And what we need to do is be able to staff up to be able to process them and send them out. And also, the postage is not a trivial issue either. Then when they come back, most ballots come back in the last week. And so what the Secretary of State is at, or let's say the auditors have asked, is, Mr. Secretary, can you support increasing the time when we can count these ballots? And if we can't get them counted before Election Day, can you give us the possibility of another week? This is putting a big strain on them to go to all absentee ballots. It's putting a big strain on our registration system because it's not really set up to send out this kind of mail-in, mail-out system. So it's not an instant snap of the fingers and all mail-in would happen. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of financial considerations, and especially in greater Minnesota, where there aren't dedicated people in each county to work just on elections. So those are the issues that we are concerned about. It's not that we think that there's any security system issues. And in fact, there's lots of documentation that mail-in balloting is very, very secure. But it is something that financially and structurally is going to be a challenge no matter which way we do it.
If I could, Senator Kent, just quickly support Senator Carlson by saying, I got an email yesterday from a county elections officer saying, please go to mail-in for everybody. What Senator Carlson's saying is exactly right out here in greater Minnesota. That's more burden. And if you look at Wisconsin, one of the problems was they did not have the capacity, and many, many thousands of absentee voters were not enfranchised at all. In other words, their vote didn't count. That is exactly what we want to avoid. And I would say, again, to amplify Senator Carlson, we're hearing from the people that actually do the ballot counting, go to mail-in only.
Thank you, Senator Frentz and Senator Rest and Senator Carlson, and thanks to all of you for joining us and asking really great questions about these incredibly important issues. Again, we are inside of 4 weeks of session remaining, and it is urgent that we really have these conversations, that Senate Republicans give these bills hearings and a chance to really have these discussions and make these protections available for Minnesotans' votes and for their health and safety. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.